Okay, kids, this study goal is a difficult one for me to teach. Here's why. The College Board does require some knowledge of laws and legal stuff. Management is important. You know, how you protect water, how you protect biodiversity, whatever. And federal lands just, it's a super wonky thing. You know that I live on federal land every summer. I've raised my children on public land. I am very, very, very well versed in the public access and enjoyment of public land. But I just don't know how much the College Board needs you to know. So I've made some slides that you can photograph or that you can save somehow if you want them. And there's like a few things you should probably know. I'll try to point them out throughout the lecture. And then the slideshow will also be available, as all slideshows are available on Neo. So this is all for study goal number 25. The federal government owns about a quarter of all land in the United States. There's different kinds of federal land. The College Board does need you to know that. And basically there are 4 separate agencies that manage 5 types of land. I'll explain. The Bureau of Land Management is the biggest of these. They have a ton of land. They don't have a lot of money. And this is mostly land that's to be used. The idea goes that for really major uses of land, like giant ranches and huge mines and stuff, we the people get some money by renting out that land to businesses, and they don't have to pay us a lot because those businesses benefit we the people. So to keep our metals cheap, the land is owned by the feds. This company never has to buy that land. They just pay a little rent so that we make back the money it costs to manage the land. That's all. We just kind of cover the management cost. Nobody's profiting really on the land ownership. And that way, the metals to make our stuff stay cheap so that our stuff is cheap. National Forest Service is very similar, but mostly focused on lumber. It's a little bit smaller. Again, it's mostly utilitarian conservation, although there is a lot of recreational usage there. Hunting, fishing, camping. You can do like small person gold panning on national forest land. It's preserved to be used. The whole purpose is, let's go ahead and use that land, but we'll use it under management so that we don't break any federal conservation laws. Fish and Wildlife controls land. That is important for fish and wildlife stuff that we primarily want to fish or hunt for food, and that involves the commercial fishing and hunting. So a lot of these are just to conserve land as a place where like the ducks go to breed, so there's a lot of ducks to shoot, for example. And then there's the national parks. This has very little land, but we spend a lot of money on each of those acres. These are the most beautiful spots, and they are picked just because they're cool. That's it. When we think there's a place so cool that private ownership would ruin it and rob we the people of its enjoyment, we make it national park land. There's very little of that land, and we spend a ton of money so that all Americans can show up and enjoy it. We pay for rangers to protect it. We pay for rangers to teach us about it. We pay for the roads and the bathrooms to make sure that everybody can just meander on through and check it out. Yosemite. There's basically no extractive use. This is recreational, aesthetic, spiritual, cultural. I forgot to put that in the slide, but there's a lot of cultural resources that are protected as national parks. And And then all four of those agencies have a special label. There are some places that are wilderness, like the place where I raise my kids every summer. These are places where you're supposed to experience it without the mark of man. So there's nothing permanent. There's no roads because that would be considered permanent. You're allowed to have some trails as long as the trails don't become permanent. So the trails are supposed to be shallow and small. Like they'll put bridges over a river, but the bridge has to wash away, for example, in a big flood. Like the whole point is these are really, really low footprint lands where you can just see nature being wild. Here's a map, and you can see just how much land it is. And you can see that it's mostly to the west. And I don't want to get too political. There are some politics, and you know, that's a public trade-off. So I'll try to explain some of the political stuff evenly. I hope I can do this even-handedly. You might ask yourself, why does the federal government own so much land? And it's important to remember that basically all the land in the United States started as federal. Depending on how you want to interpret colonial history, it was either private land that was federalized and then used publicly and then used privately again, or whatever. I don't really want to get into like the 1700s and the writing of the Constitution, but essentially, by the time that we were a confederation of colonies, we already had the idea of federal land. And then as we took more land or bought and traded with other countries, all that land went through federal ownership first. It became the United States as a federal resource. And then most of that land was divested, which means you give it to the states so they can manage it, or you give it to people. The Homestead Act or the Land Grant Act, giving away land primarily for people to work that land. And they could basically work it however they wanted. We made Caballero Family Ranch, whatever that is, 180 acres, I think. And you can see that east of the Mississippi, the states that were settled early, the feds kept very, very little land. We gave away basically all of it. The federal government owns about 4% of that land, give or take. Don't quote me on that number, but it's not much. You can see west of the Mississippi, east of the Mississippi, the federal government owns almost all of it. Now, at the most western states, the federal government owns almost all the land. And this is a big, sticky subject. Some people say, boo, you shouldn't own it, that should be private. And that's a valid point of view. But it's important to remember that the area where the feds own most of the land is really mountainous, it's dry, it's hard to reach. And farmers really didn't want most of that land. While the Homestead Act was there, you can see little pockets of farmland that were already put into private hands for farming. But a lot of this land is too crappy to farm. It's too steep, it's too far back, it doesn't have water. And so it's only good for ranching, and ranchers usually want big areas, because if you're going to run 1,000 cattle, you don't want 180 acres, you need 1,000,000 acres or whatever. Also, there's a lot of mineral deposits there because they're young mountains, and so they have mineral resources. And that's hard to value up front. So if we, the people, own all of the mining potential, then we can rent it out at a fair price and get some of that money back, but we wouldn't want to give that price away up front because we don't really know what kind of minerals are there or what it's worth. So as cattle ranching was getting big and we thought this country's going to keep growing and our economy is going to keep growing and we're going to need a lot of metals, if you let everybody go out there, it's kind of a tragedy. The commons, the resource is going to get ruined. If everybody's grazing, there's not going to be anything left to graze. And putting it into little tiny private hands got kind of difficult because like getting over the mountain isn't worth making it a single person's piece of land. And so we decided to make it managed by the federal government, and we started to keep most big tracts of land that were not super valuable as small farms. It's a fair question to ask if it's good that the federal government owns all that land. Um, I don't want to take a particular position on this, but some things are clear. It's mostly leased for commercial use. There's very, very little federal land that isn't exploited commercially. That's an important detail, and you got to remember that. Almost all that land is federally owned, but it's still being used for business. Mining, energy extraction, ranching, lumber. There's probably other uses too. And usually these rents are cheaper than private land. So if you were owning it for your family, but renting it to a rancher, on average, the federal government charges less. In most cases, it is like double-digit percentages less. So it's cheap for encouraging our economic benefit from that land. And you got to remember that in the 1960s and 70s, America started to care about the environment. We wanted to protect surface water, air quality, biodiversity. There were some areas that we just kind of wanted to keep wild. And it's way easier to do that when the federal government owns that land because they already have a right to go. They already have a map of it. They already keep track of it. So a good way to think about the feds is that they're grumpy but fair as a landlord. They charge low rent. They give you a long-term usage, but they don't mess around about the rules. If there's a federal law that says we got to protect the stupid little fish and you want to use that land, you got to protect the fish. And that's not negotiable because federal laws are the product of this huge federal democracy, and the federal government doesn't want to negotiate those rules with the end user. So they're like a grumpy but fair landlord. We could debate how fair, but it's an interesting debate. It's an interesting debate. It's also kind of cool that some areas are conserved for nature, like national parks, where any American can go and just have like a direct access to the beauty of our public lands. So essentially, anybody can go. You can go on foot. You could be a foreigner. You could be an American. You could be a disabled person, and you can go. The elderly can go. If you want to take an RV, you can go, and you can go see the geysers of Yellowstone, the beautiful mountain ranges of Glacier National Park, the smoky trees of whatever it's called in the Appalachian Mountains. And I think that there's an interesting legislated balance between what we get to use and what we don't get to use. The future of these lands is to connect them. Isolated pockets of land are not good for biodiversity. The one piece that we realize now that we need to update, we have federal laws to protect the water, to protect the land, to protect the animals. And honestly, like, we're essentially one of the best in the world at protecting our federal lands. Like, people get grumpy about it, but the amount of usage we get from our federal lands that basically pays to keep them safe is considered internationally pretty darn close to a model of perfection. Very few countries can lecture the United States about how to protect federal land. And coincidentally, very few countries do a better job of managing sharing. If this is a tragedy of the commons, we are doing pretty darn great. As far as how much stuff you can get from it versus how long it's going to last, like, the federal government does a pretty darn good job. You can go to other countries where it's a free-for-all and you can take whatever you want, but you can also ruin it. You use it up, right? You can degrade faster in other places. And there are some countries where you can lock it up in protection forever, and then you don't really know how to get access. But in the United States, it's a pretty decent system. There's a lot of democracy involved, and there's a lot of smart management involved. The one thing that's missing is we need to connect these lands. We understand genetics now, we understand species conservation, and we understand climate change. Wildlife has to move. And so there's the connectivity movement, an effort to make corridors, fenceless or roadless areas, to take all those pieces of the map and interconnect them so that wildlife can keep connected to other members of their species. And instead of isolating small gene pools, you maintain a giant gene pool across the United States. Basically, the only thing we've got left to talk about, in management terms. I have some pictures that you might find interesting. You can save these or not. This shows you the relative size of our federal nation, of our federal land total, like how much is the United States, how much is state and local, and then how much is owned by each of these agencies or managed by each of these agencies. If you want to see their budgets and how they compare, you can see that environmental protection, Indian Health and Human Services, and then like these different Forest Service, national parks, Fish and Wildlife, and Bureau of Land Management that we talked about earlier. You can also see some interesting stuff, like what kind of uses are permitted, how many regions, how much of our federal land, and so on for each of those 4 agencies. I'll remind you that you can either take screenshots. I'll go backward and I'll go forward. So you can take screenshots of these if you want, or you can go to NEO. I believe this is day 29. So you can find this information in NEO. Today is the 29th. Okay, there's those. I'll stop this. I'm sorry, that kind of rambled a little bit.